So I want to talk about how we can work with JSON. Once we're getting JSON data back and that's all working smoothly, what are some considerations that are involved in working with it? Well, one of the first things we have to acknowledge is if we're using JSON with, say, an MVC framework, and specifically the ASP.NET MVC framework, a lot of times we're not passing direct objects back and forth, we are passing view models back and forth. And so since the view is dependent on a view model and not necessarily a specific object, sometimes there are things we have to think about that maybe we don't have to consider when we're just dealing with very plain, very basic objects that we're passing back and forth. The first thing that we have to think about is serializing and deserializing. In other words, how do we get a view model into a format that JavaScript can understand? And probably the more complicated side of the equation, how do we get JavaScript into a format that ASP.NET will recognize as a view model? And in order to do this, we have to serialize and deserialize a lot of the times. Now, by default, the Web API is going to try to help us out. It has a built-in JSON deserializer, and for simple operations, that works just fine. But the more complex your view model gets, or your object gets, and in real-world application development, it always gets more complicated than a demonstration, right? You have objects that are weird, objects that are nested inside of other objects, and weird recursion and relationship patterns. You're going to get stuff back from your ORM that's going to be chains and chains of data. And sometimes the default serializer and deserializer just aren't going to cut it, or even necessarily be able to do it. So we may have to take on some of this responsibility ourselves, creating our own JavaScript objects and taking JavaScript objects and creating view models out of them. One method that's going to help us out is the JSON method. This is used server-side, and it is used to serialize objects into JSON. A lot of times, just using this method is going to be enough to get us the JSON that we need. There are other parameters we can pass into it, and there are other ways we can work with it to shape the JSON if we need to. But a lot of times, just the deliberate application of the JSON method will produce enough deserializing for you. Coming in on the back side, the serialize method in jQuery is something that can really save us a lot of time too. If we have a JavaScript object, we can use the serialize method to put it into a format that our controllers are going to understand. So this is very important as we're building the data that a view model might use. We can use the serialize jQuery method to get that into a format that our controllers can accept and work with directly. We're not always going to have to do that, but we may have to rely on this method to get the job done depending on how complex our view model is. Finally, I want to mention a JavaScript library that is extremely handy in these situations, and that's Knockout.js. Knockout.js is a JavaScript library that, like Modernizer and jQuery, is going to be set up for you automatically when you create a Web API project in Visual Studio. It's so common in these kinds of applications that Microsoft has just decided to include it as part of the package. Knockout.js is a JavaScript library that basically creates a JavaScript version of your view model. And it sort of sits between your JavaScript and your server-side view model so that whenever you make updates to it, those updates are automatically pushed both ways. So if I am using Knockout, I have this in-memory version of my view model, if you will. And so when I make changes, the UI can automatically reflect those in real time without having to do postbacks or asking the server for more data or what have you. You might think of Knockout.js as like a traffic cop or something that sits between your server-side version of your view model and your JavaScript and just make sure that both parties are synced up with each other all the time in real time. So it's an extremely handy library, and a lot of times if you go out on the web and look at example code for using the Web API, they will use Knockout.js for their templating and keeping that view model in sync. It keeps us from having to write a lot of the serialization, deserialization, and code to sync up these two entities. The Knockout.js just handles it all automatically, and so it becomes a very valuable library to add to your tool belt when you're working with JSON. Okay, so I want to show you how we can use JSON and view models in web applications and the kinds of things we need to do to make that happen. I'm also going to be using Knockout so you can see how handy a tool it is, but I'll also kind of explain as we go where the differences might be if you're not using Knockout. So what I want to do first is I want to create a page where when the user clicks this button that it gets a list of our book data and formats them in nice, neat HTML here on the screen. And we're going to get that book data from the web API. Well, one of the things I've done to help us out, of course, I've got jQuery, and I also have Knockout added as one of my scripts. And what I've done here is something that you might not have done before. This is what we call an HTML template. And this is something that Knockout allows us to do very easily. You use the script tag, and you give it an ID, which you probably haven't done with script tags up to this point, and you set the type equal to text HTML as opposed to text JavaScript. It looks a little weird, but basically what we're doing is we're trying to find a way to take a block of HTML and make it directly usable by our JavaScript. So what's going to happen here in my template is I've got this division, and you're not supposed to use inline styles, but for this case I think it'll work out just fine. And then I've got my title, my author, my price text here, and then I've got spans. And notice I've put this little attribute in here. This is for Knockout.js, and basically I'm saying that when I have an individual book, I want to data bind the title to be the text of this element. I want to data bind the author to be the text of this element, and so on. So we can set up whatever HTML we want. This is going to be the piece that repeats over and over for each book. Now, if you're not using Knockout, you can do something very similar. In fact, you can use just straight up jQuery to do this, except if you're using just regular jQuery without any extensions, what you're probably going to end up doing is using jQuery's each function to iterate over the books that you get back, and then you're going to have to spell out this HTML and how it's going to be written and concatenate in the data. So it's not hugely different than this. It's just this is a way of simplifying the operation. And if I want to change the HTML, it's very clear where that is and exactly what I need to change to get the output that I want. So that's my template. This is the HTML that's going to be generated. Okay, so a few things we need to do. We need to make a call out to the API, and we need to take that data and bind it to a view model that we can then data bind to our template. Now, if you've used the ASP.NET MVC framework before, you know that we typically will bind the view to something, an object, and generally speaking, for your more complicated web applications, you bind it to a view model, which is just an on-screen representation of the data that you need for that screen. But here, you'll notice I don't have a directive to bind to a model, and that's because Knockout.js is going to be supplying our view model. That's going to be the view model that we bind to. And so the cool thing about this is, notice this is a CSHTML file because this is an MVC view, but I could be doing this exact same thing in just a regular HTML page. I'm not relying on anything specific to the MVC framework to get this done. It's all being handled by JavaScript in the client's memory, even the view model itself. Now, granted, the web API is being managed by the MVC framework, but that's off on a web server somewhere. We don't have to worry about that. We're just writing the client. So if we just want to use regular HTML and no MVC framework whatsoever for the client, we are free to do that. So what I'm going to do is I've got this div ID book list. This is where the list is going to go. This is where the template's going to repeat. So let's get to work. One thing I want to say about Knockout.js is it provides a view model, an object that's actually called view model. And so in order for this to work, we need to get that view model populated. So I'm going to write a function to help us do that. And I'm going to do this using jQuery. I'm going to go ahead and close these as I go because I have a tendency to forget, especially as you start nesting functions inside of functions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie an event to the Get Book button here. So that has an ID of Get Book button. And when you click this button, I want to call this function. So since I'm using a knockout.js view model, I can actually just refer to it as the view model, and it's going to have a collection of books. I'm going to need to do some more code for this to work, but the view model is going to have a collection of books, and what I want to do is every time I call this, I want to clear this out. If I don't, since knockout.js is keeping an in-memory representation of my view model, then every time I click that Get Books button, it's going to keep adding, and that HTML list is going to keep growing and growing and growing. So the first thing I want to do in my function is clear out the existing view model, because I'm going to get a new one. And then I'm going to use a jQuery AJAX call. This time I'm just going to use get. This is a method in my controller back on the web API. This is the getAll method, if you will, right here. Okay. This get is just a shorthand for jQuery to say make an AJAX call and use the get method. And I need to give it a callback function. What happens when this is successful? All I need to do here, I'm making the AJAX call. It's going to be using the get method. It's going to be getting data back. It's going to be 0 to many books. All I'm going to do is just tell my view models books collection to be formed out of the data that I get back. That is actually it. Calling out to the web API, calling out to this URL, using the get method, getting data back, putting it into my knockout view model, the books collection of that view model. Now, I'm not quite done yet. There's still a little bit more that I've got to do because I want to be able to bind this to my HTML. Up here in the area that I want to bind the collection of books to, this is where I'm going to need to do some data binding. Remember that attribute. Once again, this is knockout.js. I'm going to tell it to data bind to a template. The name of the template is the ID down here, book template. And I want to bind a template for each books. Okay, doing all right so far. We're almost done. Now all I need to do is add the code that kind of glues this all together. First, I'm going to declare what my view model object is actually going to have in it. It's going to have this collection of books. Knockout observable array. An observable array is just a collection that Knockout is going to monitor. So if I make changes to the array, it's automatically going to kick off all the data binding again. So that's going to be very important as we're updating this in-memory view model. And then finally, I have to tell it to go ahead and do the data binding. And make sure I closed everything appropriately here. Okay, looks pretty good. All right, so just to recap, I've got this template here. It's set to bind JSON data to these spans. The whole collection is going to be bound to this HTML area up here, and it's going to repeat the book template for each item we get in the books collection. And what is the books collection? It's a property, it's an observable array in this viewModel object. And it gets populated with this click function up here. When I click the button, it's going to clear out whatever's in that collection, go to the web API, get the JSON back, bind it to the viewModel. Okay, let's see how that goes. Okay, so I'm getting an error that it's not recognizing the knockout object. So maybe I just linked to something weird or didn't declare something. Let me review this really quickly. Okay, so we've got this as a knockout observable array. Okay, that all looks fine. That looks fine. Let me make sure I didn't misspell a script or... Oh, well, here we go. I don't have the minimized version of Knockout. I have the full version of Knockout. All right, so it wasn't finding the Knockout JavaScript file. I had typed this by hand, thinking I had a minimized version over here, but I didn't. So we just correct that. It should be linked to Knockout correctly this time. Oh, the joys of JavaScript. Okay, so here we've got our HTML. It's pretty blank right now. When I click Get Books, it makes the call out to the web API, and then data binds to that template for each book. It goes ahead and displays the data for that book. Okay, and obviously we could mess with the HTML however we wanted to get exactly the display we wanted. One thing that I do want to point out is if I wanted to use the ID somehow, like maybe a hyperlink, to edit this book or delete this book, then in my template code, the only thing that I would do different is instead of data binding to text, I would data bind to ATTR. Okay, so for example, if I wanted a hyperlink in here and I wanted the href to reflect the ID or have the ID on the end of it or something like that, then what I could do is I could just do data bind ATTR, since this is an attribute. I don't want it to be the text of the link. I want this to be an attribute in the link, and then I just have to set up this object here where I say what the attribute is going to be, and then what I want the JSON property to be that's going to bind to it. And Knockout will go ahead and create that href attribute for me and stick the ID in there. If I wanted the text, I could also data bind to text and make link text out of it. There's all kinds of manipulations you can do, but I just want to show you that data binding to an attribute is a little bit different than data binding to text, but it's still pretty easy. Okay, so that shows us how Knockout can help us bind to a viewModel, and that's all fine and good. But what about when we want to make changes? And that's where this big commented piece is. I didn't want it to distract in the UI, so I commented it out. I made a form here. It's just a regular HTML form called New Book Form. No special MVC things. You notice there's no HTML helpers or any of the kinds of things that we come to expect from using forms with MVC. It's just straight HTML. You can use this in just a plain Jane HTML page, JSP, ASP, it does not matter. So what I've got here is a form, and I've got boxes for the title, the author, and the price. I do not have a box for the ID because I'm not allowing the user to set that. Okay, my web API is actually going to give me that ID, so I don't have a blank for that. Do have a button here to submit, to add a new book. Okay, so that's the form we're going to use. We've got our viewModel and everything set up for the get operation. What we actually have to do now is we have to set up the post operation. Post is the HTTP method we use to add a new item. So what we've got here is going to work just fine for getting book data. I'm not going to mess with it. And we still need to create the observable array. We still need to apply bindings. We still need to do all of that stuff. But what I'm going to do now is add a function for the post. Now I want to say at this point that just for demonstration purposes, I'm kind of doing all this as a bunch of functions all lined up in the same script block. There's nothing really to differentiate them or tell them apart. And in a production application, that's probably not what you want to do. What's going to probably serve you better is to take these blocks of code and put them in external JavaScript files defined by functionality. So maybe I have like a books.js file that has all my JavaScript for dealing with books. Or maybe some people will divide the JavaScript up by function, so they'll have a get JavaScript file and a post JavaScript file. Whatever makes sense to you, but I just want to point out that when you're developing your own applications, don't just dump a bunch of JavaScript into one huge block like we're doing here for demonstration. Actually take the time to architect a nice way of subdividing your JavaScript that's going to be easier to understand and more maintainable long term as you add lots of pages and lots of objects. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just to save myself some time, I'm going to create this variable called bookform and go ahead and set that equal to the actual HTML book form. Let me check my ID for that form. New book form. All right. As you can tell, I'm not a fan of creative naming conventions. I like naming conventions that tell you what the thing is. It's less confusing. All right, so now I've got my form defined. Now I need to define what happens when you submit the form. I do not want to do this when I click that button. I want to do this when the form is submitted. Okay, it's a subtle difference, but if you've worked with JavaScript and forms before, you know there's a relatively huge difference between tying this to the button's click and the form submit. The reason we want to tie it to the form submit is now we have direct access into that submit event. So if we need to stop the form submission, let's say there's a validation error or something, we can do that very easily. If we tie this to the click event on the form button, that's going to be very difficult to do. We don't have immediate direct access into that event. So this is just kind of an easier way to do this if we need to manipulate the submit event in some way. Okay. So I'm going to tie this to the book forms submit function, or the submit event rather. And when we submit, I'm going to write the function that gets called when that happens. Okay, so what exactly do we want to happen when this submits? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to grab the data out of the form to create our object. So within the confines of this function here, I'm going to say the form is this. Okay, you know what this means in JavaScript. In this particular case, it's going to be the form that kicked off the submit. Now I'm going to create a JavaScript object, a JSON object if you will, out of the data that is in this form. So I'm going to set up my book object here, and I'm going to start setting the properties. In our book class, we have an ID, a title, an author, and a price. Now this ID is going to be set by the web API, but I can't leave it blank. It's an integer. That'll probably give me an error. So what I want to do is I actually just want to take the ID and set it to 0. If you've never used JavaScript object notation before, just note that the name-value pairs are separated by a colon and not equal signs or quotation marks or anything like that. I'm going to set the title equal to, and here's where I need to pull data out of the form. Okay, so I've got this book title text box. Normally I would have named that book title text box just because I'm verbose that way, but we'll just go ahead and run with this. So the book title text box, whatever value is in there, that will become our title. And I'm just going to rinse, wash, and repeat for author and price. I think these all follow a similar convention. Yeah, book author and book price. So the author is going to be whatever value is in the book author text box. And the price is going to be whatever is in the book price text box, and that should set all of our properties. And this is the last one, so I don't want a comma there, but I do want a semicolon here because now I'm done. Okay, so now I've defined a JSON book object. Just set the ID to 0 to have something in there. Pulled the rest of the values out of the form. If I had more properties and more form fields, then I would do that, but as it is, we're good. Now what I'm going to do is put this in a format that Knockout and my web API are going to understand. And so I'm going to create a version of this book that they can understand, and I'm going to use the JSON method stringify book. You don't need to understand all the plumbing of the JSON stringify method, but basically what this is doing is it's taking my little JavaScript object and it's putting it in a format that Knockout can work with and easily serialize and deserialize when it communicates to the web API. So I'm just saving myself a little bit of work trying to take this view model and do translation. The stringify method is going to pretty much do that for me. So when I create this JavaScript object with those form values and I call stringify on it, this is now in a position to post back to the controller. It's a book object that it is going to recognize. If this were a view model, it would work exactly the same way. I would have a book view model and set all of its properties from the form the exact same way, stringify that view model, and post it back to the controller. So in this particular case, I'm going to use a full-blown AJAX call from jQuery, just so I can set up a few things that I wouldn't normally be able to do in the shorthand version. The URL, this is going out to our API. Now notice this is the exact same URL we used to get all the books. The reason that the controller is going to know the difference is because I'm going to set the method to post. And when I set the method to post, that will fire this method, post. It will take in the book object, add it to the data, and send a response back based on whether or not it was successful. If it was, I'm going to get status code created back. Going to tell it not to cache. Going to set the type to post. Going to set the data that I'm going to post is this JSON book. Content type, we are almost finished here. And then finally, I want to respond to that created status code. If I get a created status code back, then I want to make sure the created status code is 201, and I want to make sure I do something cool. And the something cool I'm going to do is update the Knockout view model. And all I'm going to do is just take my books collection and push the book onto it. Okay, so if all of this is wired up correctly, and there's certainly room for typos, so I might have to jump back. In fact, what I probably should do is go ahead and return false down here. Okay, so we can stop the normal submission of the form. Okay, so if I've wired this up correctly, we should be able to add a new book. So let's see. Test title, test author, the price is $12.99. Okay, and that goes ahead and pushes it to my view model. Now the reason the other books aren't in the view model is because I haven't gotten them. Right? So when I get the books that exist, it clears out the view model, gives me the books from the web API, and when I add a new book to it, it just adds it right onto the list if I've already got it up there. Okay, so you can fiddle around with this till you get exactly the UI behavior that you want, but you can see how I am updating the view model, and this is doing an actual post to the web API. It's not all client-side. It's going to the web API, and the web API will store it in the database, do whatever it needs to do, and send me a response back.